Good morning, church. So a quick reminder, if you were here last week, we talked a lot about this last week, but here in about a month, we're doing a church-wide spiritual disciplines retreat. It's called Refuge, and I bring it up one more time because the deadline to sign up for this is today. So this is for high school and up, and we need to have an accurate count to send to the facility this week. So if you're interested in this, you've been thinking about this, the best thing to do, you can email Debbie Carter, debbie.carter@mrcc.org, and then she'll get back with you on room options. But make sure to do that today. A lot of you have been asking questions, and a lot of you already signed up last week, but make sure to get that done today if you would like to. In a few minutes, I'm going to address all the props on the stage. A year ago, so if you're new here, a year ago we launched something called the Imagine campaign. And what this campaign is, it's an attempt to drastically reduce our church-wide debt to then free up more money on a regular basis to be used towards ministry. So we find ourselves in $4.5 million of debt, which compared to our assets is not a terrible ratio, but we've been thinking, what would it look like if we didn't have to pay those debt service payments every month? What kind of ministry could we do? And so a year ago, we launched this campaign, and many of you have responded really, really well to that campaign. So we want to remind you about this and highlight this this morning. So I'll have a few more things to say about that in just a few minutes. I want you to think about the last time someone told you an idea or a dream, and internally, you responded with a great deal of skepticism. You might have thought things like, yeah, right, you don't have the money to pull that off, or you don't have the time to pull that off, or you're being idealistic. It's pretty easy to hear someone else's idea or dream and shoot it down. And honestly, it's easy to do that with your own ideas. Some of you might have a dream, you might have an idea, but you find yourself talking yourself out of a lot of things because you don't think that they're going to work. It's pretty easy to do. I read a book called Unoffendable a few months ago, one of the best books I've read in quite a while. I really enjoyed it. Brent Hanson's the author. He tells this story in the book where he has a son in 6th grade, and he takes the son to football practice one day. It's the first football practice of the year. Brent doesn't know anything about football, and he does not realize that when he shows up to practice that the team does not have a coach. Well, one of the other boys starts playing catch with Brent, and the boy says, hey, do you mind? The boy says, hey, are you the coach of the team? And Brent says, no, I don't know anything about football. I'm not the coach. And then the boy says, well, do you mind if I call you coach? And Brent says, sure, you can call me coach, but I am not the coach. Well, a few meetings later, Brent finds out there is no coach and there's not going to be a team unless someone coaches. So Brent says, all right, I guess I'll coach, but you need to know, I actually don't know anything about football. Like, so much so that Brent had to go watch YouTube videos just to figure out the rules to football. And the organization said, hey, that's fine. We just need you to show up. And so Brent starts coaching the Rams, and as you would expect, they are absolutely horrendous. The team is awful. Brent doesn't know how to run practices. For the first 8 games of the season, not only do the Rams not win a game, they don't score a point for 8 straight games. They're 0-11. It's the last game of the year, and it just so happens that they have to play the best team in their little group. They have to play a team that is 11-0. And Brent, when he's writing the book, he doesn't say the mascot of this team. He just calls them the kids in yellow shirts with future Division I scholarships. So the 0-11 Rams are up against the 11-0 yellow shirts, and at this point, the pregame speech is not, hey, let's go out and win. It's just, let's not get embarrassed too badly. At the opening kickoff, one of the Rams players catches the ball, and in this near miracle of Little League football, somehow he gets a few blocks, and this kid runs the kickoff back for a touchdown. It's the first lead of the whole season. And so the kids are going crazy. Like, for the first time the whole season, there's this like inkling of like maybe we could pull this off. And the coach, he gets really fired up. He's like, we're going for 2. Like, just get in there. We're going to score a 2-point conversion. Well, they miss the 2-point conversion, and then the yellow shirts go on to score 77 unanswered points, and the Rams lose 77-6. Reality has a cruel way of destroying possibility. Possibility is what could be. Possibility is what you hope for. You know, it might be possible that you make it to a 1-year anniversary in a significant relationship. But the reality might be that you break up, or the reality might be that you get divorced. It might be a possibility for you to retire soon. Make all your plans to travel the world, do all the things you've always wanted to do, but it might be a reality that one of your children gets sick and you have to put all your retirement plans on hold and all your travel plans on hold. It might be a possibility that you'll get a promotion that your boss has been promising you for 4 years, but the reality might be that your boss moves away and you never get the promotion that you were promised. It might be a possibility that you or a child will live a completely normal life, but then the reality comes in and a disability keeps you from doing that. See, reality, it has a cruel way of destroying possibility. And because this is true, what tends to happen to you and what tends to happen to me is we tend to give up really quickly on our dreams. So here's a question. I'll ask it several times over the course of this message, but what area of your life needs a resurgence of imagination? What area of your life, if you had all the areas of your life, your education, your parenting, your family, your work life, your hobbies, like what area of your life needs a resurgence when it comes to imagination? You see, the truth is, the more we age, and this is so strange, the more we age, the less we dream. Because the older you get, the bad things start to happen, and you make plans that don't really happen the way that you thought they would happen, and so you want to protect yourself. And so the older you get, the less that you dream. You just assume that that's just the things that children do. Or you just assume that's just what the younger people are going to do because they're still gullible and they're still naive. And so you don't dream a whole lot. You know, one of the one person in the Bible that really pushes back against this idea that the older you get, the less you're going to dream is the Apostle Paul. He stands as this testament to dreaming even in old age. In fact, for Paul, the older he gets, some of the things he does and some of the things he says, even in old age, tend to be extremely audacious. So, for example, in the book of Ephesians, Paul prays this prayer for the Ephesian church, which is impossible. Like there's no way this could ever happen. I actually preached on this prayer last fall, but I want to read you what Paul says again and just realize how impossible this dream is. So Paul says in Ephesians chapter 3, I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power, together with all the Lord's holy people, to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ, and to know this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to all the measure of the fullness of God. So Paul is praying that they can comprehend something that is incomprehensible. And Paul is praying that they can be full of all the fullness of God. The way I illustrated this a few months ago is Paul is praying that a waterfall could fit into a drinking cup. Like there's no way that this could happen. It's impossible, and yet Paul prays it. I was reading the commentary on this verse recently, and the New Testament scholar pointed out that the Ephesians who first heard this letter, which would have probably been read aloud in a house church, probably 40 or 50 people in the audience, the first people that heard this letter were just normal people. They were artisans, they were farmers, they were business people, they were merchants, just trying to make it in life. And here is Paul praying this impossible prayer. They were probably really skeptical. Like, really, Paul? It's not going to happen. Like, there's no way that this is going to happen. Paul, you've got your head in the clouds. It's not going to be your reality. And yet, here's the strange thing for Paul. This wasn't just a one-time dream. Paul was very consistent in using his imagination, even when the circumstances did not allow for that. So for example, in the book of Acts, towards the end of the book of Acts, Paul is on trial, and he's standing before King Agrippa. Paul's in chains. He's a slave. He has no rights. He has no freedom. He's the one on trial. And you might remember this story, but in the middle of the trial, Paul looks at King Agrippa, and he tries to convince the king of Judea to become a Christian. Like, what are the odds of that ever happening? Like, if you got convicted of drinking and driving and you were standing in front of a judge and your life was on the line, what are the odds that you, in the middle of the courtroom, could convince that judge to become a Christian? Well, for you and I, we would think, well, of course you wouldn't do that. That's a terrible idea. Paul did it. He at least attempted to convert King Agrippa. That's just the kind of guy that he was. He didn't let circumstances dictate his imagination. He would keep dreaming against all odds. A few chapters later in the book of Acts, Paul's on a boat. This boat gets lost at sea. He and the passengers on the boat have not seen the sun in 2 weeks. That's how bad the storm gets. People are so hopeless on the boat, and they're so depressed on the boat that they've thrown over all the cargo, they've thrown over the food. So everybody on the boat is just sitting there ready, waiting to die. And Paul stands up in the middle of this, and he says, don't be discouraged. We're all going to be just fine. Like, I think that if you and I were friends with Paul today, like, a lot of us would get really annoyed with Paul. Because he'd be one of those guys that everything would be down and everything would be dark and all the things in life would be going against you. And Paul would say, that's all right. We'll make it. And you and I would think, really, Paul? No. You're just being gullible. You're just going to be naive. What are you thinking? You see, I actually, to be honest, I have this tension with imagination. Because on the one hand, when people come to me with just crazy ideas, I think, you really? There's no way. That's just not going to happen. It can't happen. And on the other hand, the very people which have dreams that they would die for, and the very people which are so passionate about causes that they would do anything to see this dream come through, those are the people that actually really inspire me. So I have this tension in my own heart about dreaming and about imagination. I don't exactly know what to do with it. And so when I read about Paul, I'm like, you do inspire me, but I don't want my heart to break. I don't want to dream such big dreams that they don't happen, and then my heart breaks. Well, in this letter to the Ephesians, Paul not only prays this crazy prayer of asking that we can understand and comprehend the love of God, Paul also tells us why he is able to dream such big dreams. Here's the reason. Verse 20, Paul says this, now to him, this is right after the prayer, now to him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us, to him be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus throughout all generations forever and ever. Amen. This is Paul's reason. This is Paul's rationale for why he can pray bold prayers. This is his reason and rationale for why he can stand in front of a king and try to get him to become a Christian. It's why Paul can stand up on a boat that's been in the middle of sea for 2 weeks and still say, you know what, we're going to be just fine. It's because of this verse. Now, I want to pause here on this verse and say, make a few observations about this particular verse here. First one, I got to be honest. Most of my childhood and college years, and even into adulthood, I would read this verse. And I knew it was a good verse, and I knew a lot of people liked it, but to be completely honest, I didn't have a clue what it meant. Like, it's grammatically, like, it's a nightmare. It took me forever just to figure out, like, what's the main subject? Like, where are the verbs? Like, what kind of a sentence is this? It's a hard sentence. And so for years, I'd say this, and I'd smile and act like I really liked it and understood it, but in my head, it felt like I was saying, how much wood could a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood? Like, it's hard. So, now most of you are like, well, I get it. I've always got it. But if you're like me and you're like, thank you, Phil. Someone else doesn't understand this. I've read about this. I've read some smart people, what they think about it. Here's just a few things that you should know about this verse. First of all, let's just break it down to its simplest form. If you take out all the different preposition and clauses and just like, what's the main truth that Paul's trying to get through? It's this. God can do more than you imagine. God has the capacity to do more than your wildest dreams. So if you could take a year and come up with the craziest dream, God not only could think that dream, he could actually bring it into reality. Like that's how much greater God's capacity is to think and to dream than you and I. So another way to think about this would be, if you put a second grader in a room with Leonardo da Vinci and you told them both to draw for a while, and then you compared their pieces of art, obviously there'd be a big gap. There'd be a huge gap between what the second grader could draw and what Leonardo da Vinci could draw. However, that second grader's art is actually much closer to Da Vinci's art than your dreams are to God's dreams. That's how much larger God is than you. So, for example, one of the things we ask for a lot is healing. We're sick, we want to get better, we pray about that a lot. I pray about that a lot. And yet, what does God do over the course of Scripture? Sometimes he heals people, but what he's really concerned about is he's concerned about destroying all evil at the cross and reconciling the entire universe. So we spend many of our days kind of in the small world of what we're going through, but God's dreams, what God can do, it's way beyond anything that you could ever even imagine. Now, if you're tracking with me here, then one pushback thought, which I have to this, is pretty simple. If God can do more, why doesn't he? Why didn't he stop the drunk driver? Why didn't he stop the cancer? Why doesn't he end poverty? And I'm not exactly sure the answers to all those questions, but here's at least one place to start on wrestling with this idea that God can do more, but often he doesn't do what we want him to do, and it's simply this. God is not a character in your imagination. You are a character in God's imagination. And so that completely changes the game. In fact, look at this next clause, which I think is really important. God can do more than you imagine according to his power that is at work in us. So think about this. The God who created the universe and who dreamed up this whole story of humanity, that God is now at work in your life, in you. Like you get to play a part in the great redemptive story of God. Meaning, if you think about it this way, it's hard to wrap your mind around this, but you are actually a product of the imagination of God. He started the whole story. He dreamed this all into existence. Therefore, you are a product of his imagination. I like reading good fiction. I'm very moved by what authors can do. It's amazing what a good author can do with ink and a page. I remember being a kid reading Red Fern Grows for the first time, and I couldn't finish the book because the tears were just streaming out of my eyes and onto the page. I was moved by what an author could do in a story. You might think about your favorite author. Maybe it's John Grisham. Maybe it's J.K. Rowling. Think about what amazing authors can do with their stories. Now think about this. If human authors can keep us on the edge of our seat, turning page after page after page, and if human authors can move us to tears, and if human authors can depict these plot twists that literally drop our jaws, do you think that God is less skilled as the author of life? Like he's the one writing the story, and he dreamed it up. And if human authors can have good chapters and bad chapters and scenes of darkness and scenes of light, if they can weave all that together into incredible stories of hope and redemption, don't you think that the author of life can handle the story that he's writing and that he is creating? You see, God really can do more than you can imagine. And you are a product of his imagination. One more thing to think about. You were created in the image of a dreamer. You were created in the image of a dreamer. God's a dreamer. You're created in his image. Therefore, here's my case here. I think that Christians should be on the leading edge of imagination. Not because you're so creative or you're so gifted, but because your God is creative. I mean, think about this. Think about art and music. 500 years ago, it was the Christians who were leading the way when it came to imagination, art. music. The most creative people were Christians. That's not the case anymore. It seems that the Christians in general, I'm making a general statement. I know there's anomalies to this, but in general, Christians have in some ways secluded ourselves from culture. And yet I think that if we are created in the image of a dreamer, we should be on the forefront of being the best imaginative people in the world. Bring Paul back into the picture. This is why I think Paul could dream so big. It's why he did dream so big. It's not because Paul necessarily believed in his own gifts and his own abilities. Paul really believed in his God. You see, if anyone had the right to let imagination die, it was Paul. In fact, when he writes the Ephesian letter, he's in prison. He's got shackles on his wrists. His body's falling apart. And yet he prays impossible prayers. And he speaks into existence impossible dreams. Paul prays that a mortal could comprehend the love of an immortal God. So is Paul being naive? Is Paul being gullible? Is he being idealistic? I think Paul's imagination simply stemmed from the imagination of God. Walter Brueggemann wrote a book 25 years old, which a lot of scholars say is one of the top 10 books of the last 50 years. It's called The Prophetic Imagination. And Brueggemann's big point in this book, he looks at Moses, Jeremiah, and Jesus. And Brueggemann makes this point that these people had to imagine the world that they wanted before they could create that world. So Moses had to first imagine what would it look like for Israel not to be under the tyranny of slavery. He had to imagine that world before he could walk into that reality. Jeremiah had to ask the question, what would a world look like without exile? And for him, that dream never came true, at least in his day. So I want you to think about your life. What area of your life needs a resurgence of imagination? What would your life look like with more discipline? What would your life look like with less addiction? Let's talk about our church for a minute. We have been asking the question, what would Memorial Road Church of Christ look like if we had less debt? So, like I said earlier, a year ago we launched this campaign called the Imagine Campaign. The Imagine Campaign comes from Ephesians chapter 3, the verse that I'm talking about today. That's where we got this campaign. And so we started dreaming what could be done with potentially the money freed up. So I want to highlight a few of these because it's been a year and it's easy to forget. So one thing we thought we could do is we could do a lot more to help rural churches, especially in the state of Oklahoma, that are really struggling, if we had more money freed up to do that. The world is a symbol for our missionaries throughout the world. Just like the story Scott just told, we have a substantial missionary presence throughout the world, but the question is what could we do to increase that footprint even further? We don't have an adequate senior care ministry as far as that goes to the size of our church, and so this is one of the things that we're wondering, what would that look like with freed up money? We could do quite a bit more with our care and counseling offices. We have dreams of expanding that into a pretty large center to take care of benevolence needs in our own church and benevolence needs in the community, which we have so many that happen every single week and month and year at this church family. What could that look like? What would it look like to build a halfway house so that people that are in our prison ministry, when they get out, that they can have a better way to rehabilitate into normal life? What would it look like to make some necessary improvements to our physical structure? Over here, Q groups have become a vital part of this church family, and they've basically happened organically behind the scenes, but what would it look like if we could put more resources into our small group ministry? The star represents what we're calling an MRCC Dream Fund. We have 30 ministries that are always operating, women's ministry, children's ministry, transportation ministry, and oftentimes they have ideas, the ministry directors, but we don't have funds to pull those ideas off. So what would that look like to have funds available for ministry dreaming? This umbrella stands for a ministry that we'd love to start someday called MRCC Cares, which is basically what would it look like if our church family could respond very quickly and nimbly when needs happen in our community. So for example, the teacher strike a year ago. What if we had already funds set aside where we could have done something to support those teachers at that time. One dream that is really at the heart of our church family is fostering an adoption. What would it look like if we could actually put more money into that ministry? And then church planting. This is one we're already taking steps towards, but what would it look like to be able to support the two churches we've planted in the last 18 months? And then what would it look like at Memorial Road to have a residency program in which we could do a better job of cultivating young ministers, training them here, and then launching them out into the world? So we have these 12 dreams. We're thinking about them, about what could happen if we had more funds freed up. Now, I just want to give you a few updates as far as things that have happened since we launched this a year ago. So one thing that's happened, we tasked 12 study groups behind the scenes to do feasibility studies for all 12 dreams, asking questions, what would it take to pull this off, how much money would we need, and then tangibly, what could we actually accomplish through these ministries. So all these groups have been meeting. Another thing that's happened is some of the ministries have already started to take steps towards fruition even without the proper resources. So for example, our fostering and adoption ministry is already started to take off through a Wednesday night class program, which is to support families who are fostering or adopting. So there are some things that are starting to happen. Now let me give you another update on the money side of things. There's a lot to celebrate as far as what we've already given this past year to the Imagine campaign. So a year ago, we pledged as a church to give $2.7 million towards this campaign. Now keep in mind, this is not normal contribution money, and this is not money that we give each year in our special missions contribution in the summer. You all pledged to give $2.7 million towards this campaign. And in the first year, we've already collected $1.5 million of those pledged funds. So we're already past half of what we pledged for a 3-year campaign. And so really we're doing very, very well as far as paying off what we said that we would. And another bit of great news is that we've had $100,000 come in of money that was not pledged as part of the $2.7 million. So we're doing really, really well when it comes to our giving so far. Now I'll also make one note about church planting. So we took around the first $700,000 given towards this campaign to buy a piece of land in North Edmond that eventually the Heritage Church of Christ is going to build on. And that church plant is going really, really well so far. So they launched about a year ago. They went public about 6-7 months ago. When they went public, there was about 70 people that had gone from Memorial Road to start that church. And last month, when they celebrated their year anniversary, they had 128 people in attendance. And I heard from one of their members that in the last 6 months, they've actually had 17 families place membership that do not attend the Memorial Road Church of Christ. That's great, great news about what this church family has been able to do through church planting. So a few practical things. Number one, for those of you who have pledged towards this $2.7 million number, keep making your pledges. A lot of you are doing that in monthly payments. Some of you are doing that in lump sums here and there. Keep making your payments. They're very, very helpful. We're paying off the debt faster, the faster that you all make your payments. Secondly, if you are new to this church family, maybe this is the first time you're hearing about this, you can get engaged in this campaign at any time. You can go to that next slide. So you can participate any time. If you would like a packet, we have packets which go over all these dreams in a lot more detail. They are at Information Central, so I would encourage you to go pick one up, and they also have pledge cards at the back of that packet. You can give any time by putting a check or envelope marked Imagine in the collection plate. You can give online, or you can contact Tammy McKeever. And then final thing I'll say practically is, if your financial situation's changed in a positive direction this last year, then I would ask you to consider upping your gift for the Imagine campaign, because the more debt that we can pay off, the more ministry we'll be able to do as a church family. So back to the main question I want you to think about as far as your personal life goes. What area of your life needs a resurgence of imagination? Would you say that's parenting? Maybe for you is friendship. You're wanting to rethink what friends even look like in your life. Maybe it's your marriage. Could be your devotional life, which has taken a hit in the last few months. Maybe it's your generosity. Maybe it's the degree that you thought you'd always go back and get. I want to read you a quote from a great book called Community. It's written by a guy named Peter Block. He says this: possibility is a declaration of what we can create in the world each time we show up. It could be peace, could be inclusion, reconciliation. Peace may not reign in this moment, but the possibility, I love this thought, the possibility of peace does enter the room because we walked through the door. In other words, you are a walking, talking possibility. And your life is this blank canvas on which God can create a masterpiece one day at a time. The quote continues, the possibility is birthed through the act of declaration. In other words, you have to say it for it to become a reality. So you have to speak your possibility into existence, whether that's, I want to take a painting class, or I want to start a business, or I want to raise money for a mission trip. You have to speak it through the act of declaration, and then it is accomplished through the act of doing. So step one is to declare, and step one is to do. Possibility. You are a walking, talking possibility. And I encourage you to start dreaming again. To start dreaming about what your life could be like, what your relationship could be like. Now, if you do this, if you take the track of the Apostle Paul and you start dreaming things that are pretty radical, and people would say, no, you shouldn't do that. That's too much. If you do this, does this mean that everything is going to work out the way you want it to? Absolutely not. But that's not the point here. Imagination is not just helpful. This is really important, so focus in for just 2 or 3 more minutes. Imagination is not just helpful for what happens at the end of your journey. Imagination is actually helpful for getting you through the journey. The very act of dreaming, for many of us, that's what gets us through. In fact, there's no better example of that than Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., arguably the greatest dreamer of the last 100 years. In one of his final speeches towards the end of the civil rights movement, he actually showed quite a bit of vulnerability. He was getting really tired of carrying the dream. And here's what he said. He said, I'm not going to fool you this afternoon. Sometimes I feel discouraged, living every day under the threat of death. Sometimes I feel discouraged. Having to stand amid the surging moment of life's restlessness. Sometimes I feel discouraged. Having to face the problems and the frustrations, sometimes I feel discouraged. Sometimes I feel discouraged and feel that my work is in vain. King's tone switches here, if you could hear him. He begins to proclaim the gospel, I think, both to his listeners and to himself. Here's what he says next. But then the Holy Spirit revives my soul again. I heard the voice of Jesus promise never to leave me alone. No, never alone. No, never alone. He promised never to leave me alone. You see, sometimes dreams need to be resurrected, and sometimes dreamers need to be revived. So you might be really discouraged right now because you have a dream that didn't necessarily come true. I would encourage you, dream it again, even if it doesn't come true. There's something about the act of imagining and something about the act of dreaming that really helps us get to the goal and get to the end. Because the truth is, the end is going to be quite a bit better than you thought it would be. So when the Rams lost that game 77-6, they walked off the field, their heads were hung low, they were pretty discouraged. They looked out into the parking lot, and there were 2 really big, fancy white limousines with gloved drivers standing outside the limousines. And the Rams thought, oh, well, those must be limousines picking up the 12-0 yellow shirts who have just crushed us. And then their parents told them, no, those limousines are for you. And so the 0-11 6th grade boys Rams team got in these limousines, and there were snacks, and there were drinks, and there were all sorts of fun things inside the limousines, and the limousines drove these boys to an incredible pizza party. And as they were driving away, the boys looked out the windows to the 12-0 yellow shirt team, and they looked really, really jealous. You see, what those boys wanted was just to win a football game. But what they got was the most extravagant party of their life. You see, you might want something, but you might get something else. See, here's the bad news. The bad news is your life is not going to go the way you thought it would, and the bad news is your dreams are not going to come true the way you thought that they would. But the good news is this: God's dreams will come true. And so the question is, would you rather your dreams come true or God's dreams come true? There is nothing that can shatter the dream of God, and you are part of that dream. And so therefore, there is hope for you, because His dreams, honestly, they're just better than our dreams. And so we're about to sing a song about God's ability to make something out of nothing and to make a way where there really doesn't seem to be like there's any way forward. And if you find yourself just stuck, not knowing what to do, let this church help you. Let us pray for you. Let us love on you today. If there is anything that you need this morning, why don't you come while we stand and sing?